Welcome back. It's time for lesson number 3. And as you can see here, this lesson is called vSAN Capacity Monitoring. Now this lesson is not too long. And as you can see here, when it comes to the goals, it is quite simple. The idea here is we want to take a look at the vSphere client to understand how you and your peers are using the space in the vSAN data store. Now, when you take a look, the first thing we're doing here is we're selecting the cluster. And as you can see here, once we select the cluster, somebody here is clicking on the Monitor tab. And when you click on the Monitor tab, you have this entry called Capacity. Now, there's all sorts of information available to you here. Here you can see we have 2 tabs. One is called Capacity Usage. The second one is called Capacity History. And in this case, in this particular illustration, I can see number 1, how big is my vSAN data store? Number 2, I can see whether or not I'm running out of space. And number 3, I can see how much space is still free or available. Now, if you look here, there's a little explanation about what they mean by actually written. Now, if you take a look, it says information in the capacity overview includes used, and in quotes, actually written space at the capacity tier, and then free space on disks. Because if you think about it, remember that we're talking about how much space you're using. But again, that to a point could be a bit confusing or misleading, considering the fact that you could be using a variety of different policies, or for that matter, the fact that, again, you got to remember that most of your VMs, if not all of your VMs, are going to be thin provision because they are thin provision by default. So if you take a look in this case, I'm not even remotely close to running out of space. According to this, I have about 192 gigs of free space, and I have only used up 8 gigs. You can even see the percentage. Now, some of you guys may have enabled deduplication and compression. Others, nowadays, compression only perhaps. Some of you guys don't enable either one. So not only, again, I can see how much space I still have free, but I can also save how much I'm saving because of dedupe and compression. And you can even see the ratio. So, some of you guys, again, will use dedupe and compression. And remember, with deduplication and compression enabled, the advantage is that you can save a lot of space. If there is a disadvantage, it's the fact that you cannot remove a capacity disk from a disk group. You would have to take apart the entire disk group. That's why in 7.0 Update 1 we introduce compression only. Now with compression only, you will not save as much space compared to if you enable both. But if you lose a disk, I'm talking about a capacity disk, then you don't have to take apart the entire disk group. All you have to do is simply remove and replace the failed disk. Now, when we look at this page, remember, you may see, for example, that you have 100 gigs available, but that doesn't really mean that you have 100 gigs of unique space. Think about it. If your VMs are two-way mirrors, if it says you have about 100 gigs free, in this case 191, realistically, if your VMs are going to be two-way mirrors, you only have space for half of them. So the numbers will change, whether you're using the default policy or other policies like RAID 5. So when you look at the bottom of the screen, when we're talking about capacity usage, you can see that when it comes to usable capacity analysis, you could choose, right, to go with the default storage policy. In that case, as you can see here, if I have 191 gigs of free space, realistically speaking, I only have space for 95 gigs. That value, 95 gigs, will change if you change the policy. So for example, if I select RAID 5 instead of FTT1, you better believe that when it comes to effective free space, that number would increase. Because remember, if your VM is 100 gigs, if your VM is a two-way mirror, that VM potentially could use 200 gigs. With RAID 5, you're saving 33% of the space compared to a two-way mirror. Just like, for example, RAID 6, will save you 50% of the space compared to a three-way mirror. So you may want to look into this, but again, remember, just because you see 191 gigs of free space, it doesn't mean that you really have that. You may have to divide that by 2, again, if your VMs are two-way mirrors. Plus, remember, there's something called slack space that you may want to consider. And if you take a look, if you want detailed information on how the space is used, you can see it right here. So in this case, you have this pretty chart that shows you how all the space is being used. Now, this is not what you're going to see in real life. I'm assuming, of course, in real life, in a production environment, most of your space will be used by your virtual machine objects. But again, remember, here in class, we only have a handful of VMs. And again, they don't even have an OS installed. And if the VMs are thin provisioned, they don't use a lot of space. But here you can see the breakdown on how the space is being used. Typically, I would expect the majority of the space to be used by the virtual machines. But if you think about it again, some of the space is also used by the statsdb object, your file service objects, or for that matter, also if you use SCSI, that as well. Now, there's also overhead when it comes to some of the features that we use. So if we look at this example, you can see the breakdown between VMDKs and swap objects. And just like that, you have again these other entries for overhead, including the one for dedupe and compression. And again, in real life, dedupe and compression will never use 51% of the space. That's only in class. And if you take a look, not only I can take a look at capacity usage, I could also click on the tab called Capacity History. And this gives me an idea of how quickly, let's say, I'm using up the space over time. So this kind of helps you figure out how quickly you're growing, if you're growing at all. And again, at what point you may want to consider perhaps growing the size of your vSAN data store. Now, we've talked about this briefly before. And again, remember, in 7.0 Update 1, you have this new feature called vSAN Capacity Reserve. Now, here, we're looking at the Monitor tab. And this feature, again, is not enabled by default. So if you click on Configure, this again would allow you to reserve a portion of the space of the vSAN data store for operations and or for host rebuild operations as well. So when you take a look, in a few minutes, you will have the chance to perform not one but 2 labs. One is going to be similar to my first demo. That's going to be the one dealing with Skyline Health. The second one is the one that again allows you to look at all these performance related charts, and also it allows you to see how your space is being used in your vSAN data store. All right, so please again take a look at my demos and have fun. Thank you guys.